Joe says the concepts of the puzzles are simple. In the beginning, as they teach you them, they are simple, but later they do become more complicated. But that actually requires you to play the game. But tis Joe coming in with a nice burn for the win. You would actually have to play the game to know that the puzzles get more complex beyond the tutorials. Ha ha ha! Dude, I gotta put that down. Hang on, hang on. That's a brilliant starting point for a video, Joe. We're gonna riff off of that right now really quick, guys. That'll be a nice reverse rage bait video that's gonna go out later today on YouTube. You actually have to play the game to know the puzzles are hard. That's a good I feel like that's true of like most of the concepts of this game. So in the early stages of the game, yes, the puzzles are extremely simple. Because it's a tutorial. Also, in the early stages of the game, the character dialogue can feel somewhat simplified, especially with a character like Balara, because they're teaching you the characters. They're getting your team assembled. The stakes aren't really that high when you don't know the characters because they're just characters. They're not actually people that you have an emotional relationship with. They are exactly they are setting the scene. So the stakes aren't very high in the beginning. The dialogue is simplistic in the beginning. The puzzles are simplistic in the beginning because it's onboarding new players who have never played this franchise before, who might not have ever played an RPG before, who might not have ever played an action RPG before. Interestingly enough, I had a meeting yesterday for one of these projects I'm involved with, and the specific conversation in that meeting was, how does our new player experience feel? And they were looking at specifically the first hour of the game. How does the first hour of the game feel to a player who is a veteran of this type of video game? And how do you think it feels for someone who might not be a veteran of the video game? Who might not have never played a game before. So companies are very much looking at things from the perspective of how do we get new players in who have never played this style of game before, and how do we onboard them? It is vitally important that that onboarding process is as simple as possible because you need to get players in and into the game within the first hour. So it needs to be as basic as it can. So the puzzles are very simplistic in the early stages of this game. They do get more complex as you go deeper on. One of the examples I would get, and I think if Dribrom is still up here, I think he said this the other day, there's a quest you get in Renfail, which relates to finding some Grey Warden. Like there's essentially there are 3 switches that you have to toggle to open up this treasure room. Those 3 switches are hidden in various places. 2 of the switches are relatively easy to find, but they do require that you've progressed the game a little bit because you need certain characters to unlock certain areas of the game. So you know how like here we've been running around and we've been using Harding to like move stone around. Well, Tash has some abilities where she can like melt things and etc. And you need both of those characters to get to at least one of the switches that you need to unlock the Warden treasure in that zone. I think Dribrom said it took him like 20 minutes the first time he did. It was like 20-30 minutes for me as well to figure out that puzzle the first time. Because the first switch is really easy. The second switch is a little harder. And then the third switch isn't about finding a switch at all. It's about finding these gravestones. Like, maybe not gravestones, I think it's actually skeletons. I think you have to find these skeletons that have like glowy butterflies around them, but you have to find them in a specific order, and then you have to follow the ghosts from one skeleton to the next skeleton to the next skeleton until finally the ghost will lead you to a secret wall which unlocks this area where you can find the switch. That is a perfect example of a more complex puzzle that you find later on in the game. But if you haven't actually played the game beyond the first 2 hours because you only played the first hour and a half and then you refunded the game on Steam and went out and made your review because this game sucks, I didn't like it, it was too simplistic, this is written by a 7-year-old. If you did that and you didn't play more than the first hour and a half of the game, of course you're going to think that there's not actually any complexity to the stuff. Yeah, exactly, Than. The people who are like, it's not my Dragon Age. Rah! Like, there are, I would argue that this is not a puzzle game in the first place, so the puzzles are never going to be like groundbreaking, earth-shattering, best puzzles designed since Einstein wrote the theory of relativity, nor do they need to be, because this is a story-based, narrative-driven action RPG. So the principal component to this game is the story and the relationships between the companions. But I think the companions are also a good example of something that is very simple in the beginning because you don't know them. There's no emotional connections to them. Like Harding, when you meet, Harding's right behind me somewhere. Oh, these two characters are perfect. These are the two story characters that actually brought me to tears when I was watching their playthroughs in my first playthrough of the game. Harding, and this is total spoiler territory, but I'm on my second playthrough, so tough shit. Harding's character, when you first meet her, she cannot move stone around. So you would never know that there are puzzles that need to be solved using her stone abilities. If you only played the first hour and a half of the game, you would never know that Harding is required to do certain puzzles in the game. In addition, Tasha's character can't do the fire thing with her puzzles until you actually get her in the party and actively play her as a character. If you never progressed the character, if you never played the game, you don't find her in the first hour and a half of gameplay. She doesn't come along until, I want to say it's like 10 or 15 hours into the game before you ever even get to Tash. She's one of the last two characters you get, her and Emmerich. So you can't even access the puzzle areas in the game until you've actually put 10 or 15 hours into the game because you don't even get Tash's character until that point. And then what about the puzzles in the game that require you to use Harding's ability with Emmerich's ability, with Nev's ability, with Tash's ability to unlock these various areas of the zone to get to in order to unlock certain things. And also Lucanus, his demon's ability to pull things out of the shade and like create the additional platforms that you're required to use to like jump from one side to the other to get to that secret box over there, or to find the lever that you need to click to drop down the ladder over here. Like, all of that requires you to have actually gone out there, played the game, gathered the companions, and in the case of like Harding as an example, gotten them to the point where they can use their special abilities in the first place. So there's definitely something to think about in terms of the people who say that the puzzles are written by a 5-year-old and there's no complexity to them, or that there's no depth to any of the characters, or that the writing sounds like it's written by a 5-year-old. The early stages of the game need to be simple to onboard new players. Now, if you're a veteran RPG player, oh yeah, it definitely is simplistic. 100%. The early 10 hours of this game feel like you're on training wheels, if that makes sense. Because I'm an MMORPG veteran, I'm an RPG veteran, I'm a shooter veteran. Like, I've been playing games for 35 years. Like, I'm a veteran of games. So the early stages of this game absolutely felt like they were on training wheels. That's okay, because we're learning new things, we're meeting new characters. And for someone like my wife, who has never played any of the previous games before, this is the perfect entry point into this franchise, and it's a perfect learning experience of how to play an RPG. How do I do the combat? How do I do puzzles? And I think that's something that's gotten lost in the conversation with a lot of the veteran players who, again, went into it with expectations of this is going to be a super hard, complex. Because if you remember back in the day, like, Dragon Age Origins didn't have as much of a hand-holding experience. And the reason for that is because that was made 15 years ago, 20 years ago, if you want to go back to the design table, back before game companies were creating easy to follow new player experiences, because back in the day, the only people that played video games were video game nerds. Now, video game is a mass market enterprise, and you have people who never played games before coming in and playing games for the first time. And that's a completely different demographic, and it's a completely different marketing approach to how games are built, marketed, and played, because you have to factor in that you have new people coming in who have never played a video game before. Whereas 15, 20 years ago, game companies were going, "Now, you know what? The only people playing these games are the people who have already played games. We don't need to do any hand holding, because the only people who are playing these games are people who already know what they need to be doing." So it's a game design philosophy shift. And this is why I always come back to the benefit that I have is having spent over a decade in game development and game design. I do like to think that that allows me a little bit of wisdom, and I'm always going to traditionally look at it from the perspective of the game developer as opposed to the average gamer, especially when you're looking at the veteran gamers. Than says, even with character development, like Balara is very fangirly and scatterbrained, but once you get the time, you learn about their traumatic backstory and how she doesn't know how to handle her feelings. She doesn't know how to honor that story. What do I do? The weight of that. How do I serve that? And that's absolutely true. I think all of the characters have these massive arcs. Like, Harding has to come to grips with her newfound power. What does that mean? Well, that story gets super deep because it gets into the origin of the dwarves and the war with the Titans and the creation of the Fade and Solus and Mithril and the elves and what the elven gods did. You're never going to know that if you've only played the first hour of the game or the first 2 hours of the game, because you don't find out Harding's story until much later. Tasha's character is another good example of a character who, in the beginning, you may hear she's just a dragon hunter. Well, that dragon hunter storyline becomes much more complex because of the emotional journey that she's going to go on of self-identity with her mom and transitioning from a she into a they-them and realizing that they are not who everyone else wants them to be. You're never going to see that journey or know anything about that journey in the first hour and a half to 2 hours of gameplay. Bubbaloni, I think a good compromise is to do what Star Wars Outlaws did, which is if you don't want to deal with those tutorials at all, turn them off. Like, I think Star Wars Outlaws had a great... they just said, if you don't like puzzles, if you don't like hacking, if you don't like... just turn it off. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. Like, it's there for the people who want it, but if you don't want to do it, you just turn it off. Like, ignore it. Like, if you don't need it, ignore it. Like, I think it's good that game companies provide lots of options. So I think that's definitely something that maybe BioWare could patch in a later patch as a quality of life thing. Is just maybe the ability to just turn the tutorial bits completely off somehow, or to turn off like puzzle components. I don't know if that's something they could work into their design, but that was a good conversation point, Joe. Thandar says, actually, I remember Thor talking about the game show and how they left controllers and keyboards on the show floor for new players to check out. And some, I remember, I saw that YouTube short. How some, or his TikTok actually, how some of the newer players, he said some of the players knew how to use the keyboards, but none of them knew how to use controllers, because these days everything is touchscreen, and more often than not they had to show the younger audience even how to use a remote control, because everything they did has been touchscreen, so they don't even know how to like use a controller or a mouse and keyboard. It's a legit thing, and those people are playing games, and you have to factor in like how do we introduce those players into a game while also satisfying our hardcore audience who has played games before.